there. Innovation is a topic that I care a great deal about, and so does Google. I mean, we really breathe, eat, and breathe and live innovation at Google. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about innovation and the internet, and I'm going to try to relate it to the kind of conditions under which innovation turns out to be productive. And so we'll see whether I succeed when we get to some Q&A. Let me start out just by making an observation about the scale of the internet. It's a vast environment, which you can't see because I changed my display here, and you can't see it. There we go. I have to coordinate. There are a large number of devices that are internet capable. Nobody knows how many, so this is a guess. And it includes a lot of different kinds of things, whether it's laptops or smartphones or hosts in a cloud computing system. The number of users, again, is just an estimate of about 3 billion. There are, however, 7 billion people in the world, so it's clear that we have a long way to go to put everyone up on the net, which is my objective. And of course, there are mobiles which have entered into the market as far back as 1984, but the smartphone is the most important element of internet today, and those appeared around 2007, 2008. It's pretty amazing, considering it's only been 7 or 8 years since those smartphones were available, that we have become so fixated on using them, and we have been taking advantage of the possibility to create applications for these smartphones so easily. Many hundreds of thousands of people have created millions of apps for these devices. So that's sort of the state of internet statistics in a very general sense. And if we look now at the internet itself, I want to emphasize for you what it is that has made the internet such a fertile space in which to invent. The first really bizarre thing is that the internet was not designed to do anything in particular, no particular application. Unlike the networks of the past that were designed for specific things like the telephone system, the telegraph system, the cable television broadcast system, those are all special purpose networks. The internet was designed to do only one thing. It's to move little electronic postcards around that are full of bits. The network has no idea what it's doing or why it's doing it. All it knows is it's moving these packets of data around. One of the things that Bob Kahn and I decided in the early design stages in 1973 was that we should try to future-proof the architecture of the internet. What do we mean by that? We knew in 1973 that there would be new transmission and switching technologies invented in the future. And we wanted the design of the internet to be able to absorb and take advantage of all those new technologies, which means that the basic architecture had to be insensitive to the underlying transmission and switching technology. And so we made it ignorant of the kind of transmission that was going on. It's kind of like a postcard doesn't know how it's being carried. It could be in an automobile, an airplane, a ship, a bicycle. The postcard doesn't know, and it doesn't care. Now there's another property which is important, and that is that the internet doesn't know what the packets mean, just like a postcard doesn't know what was written on it. So the intelligence of the internet, the interpretation of the contents of the packets, happens at the edges of the net, at the source and the destination. And because of that, if you invent a new application, which means interpreting the bits of the packets differently, the network doesn't have to change. And this means that you can invent new ways of using packet switching without having to reinvent the internet itself, the basic transmission and switching system. So each packet could have a piece of a web page or a little bit of audio, a little bit of video, maybe part of an email. It doesn't matter to the internet. We call this permissionless innovation in the following sense. If you can figure out how to design and build a new application and interpret the bits of the packets in the way this application requires, you're free to go and do that on the net. You don't have to change the network. You don't have to get permission from every internet service provider in the world. In theory, we would like you not to have to get permission from a regulator or anything else. You should simply be able to try out your new application. And for the most part, for the history of the internet's operation, that's been the case, that people have been free to design and build new applications on the net and try them out. The internet was designed in 1973, but it took us 10 years to get to the point where it could be implemented on enough different operating systems that we could turn it on. So it was actually turned on formally in January 1st, 1983. So it's coming up on its 33rd birthday of operation in just a month or so. So this permissionless innovation has been the source of an economic engine, certainly in the United States, and I would submit elsewhere. Companies get to start and develop new applications and make them available without having to go through a great deal of paperwork, so to speak. Another thing which is very interesting about the internet design is that it has scaled up in size. In 1983, when we turned the internet on, there were 400 computers on the network. That's all. They were big time-sharing machines, and they served anywhere from 1,000 to 10,000 people. But the internet, as you could tell from the statistics, has grown pretty dramatically, not only in the number of users and the number of computers or computing devices on it, but also in terms of the bandwidths that it can handle. When the first backbone was put together and turned on in 1983, it was running at the blazing speed of 50 kilobits per second, which is sort of a dial-up modem today. That was broadband back in 1983. There were some of the other nets, like the satellite network and the mobile packet radio net that were part of the original internet, were operating at slightly higher speeds, 100 kilobits, 400 kilobits per second. Interestingly enough, though, even then, in that ancient period, we had enough bandwidth to try ideas out like packet voice and packet video. So these experiments in applications like that were going on more than 30 years ago, in the mid-1970s, the early 1980s. Email was invented on the predecessor to the internet, the ARPANET, in 1971. So although we're using a lot of applications today which feel like they're brand new and very exciting, some of us were poking the edges of possibility many, many years ago, but we couldn't scale it up because there wasn't enough capacity. But as time has gone on, optical fiber has come along. Fibers run faster and faster. The fibers in the Google backbone are running at 100 gigabits a second. By the end of this decade, they'll be running at a terabit per second. And you can have multiple channels per fiber. So, and the data rates on radio have been going up over time. And as we move to higher and higher frequencies, like 60 to 70 to 85 gigahertz, we'll be able to take 5 gigahertz of bandwidth on those high-frequency channels and deliver many gigabits per second on an end-to-end basis to the users. So what has happened is the Internet's architecture has been able to absorb all of that expansion. Now, I have to admit, we did make one mistake. In 1973, we tried to figure out how many terminations we should design into the global network. And we said, okay, how many networks will there be per country? And we had just finished getting the ARPANET running all the way across the US and into Europe. And that was not an inexpensive proposition. So we thought, well, maybe there will be 2 national scale networks per country. And then we said, how many countries are there? And there wasn't any Google to ask. So we guessed at 128, which was wrong, but that's okay. So we said, okay, 128 countries times 2 networks is 256 networks. And so that's 8 bits. identifier. And then we said, how many computers will there be per network? And we said, well, why don't we be generous? How about 16 million? And so that was 24 bits. So we had a 32-bit address that would accommodate up to 4.3 billion terminations. This is 1973, and we don't even know if this is going to work. So we thought that is enough capacity to try the experiment. And of course, I thought if it was a successful experiment, that then we would design a production version of the internet. That didn't happen because the experiment escaped into public use around 1989. And so you're running the experimental internet right now. It's called IP version 4. But in 1992, we recognized that we were going to run out of address space. We weren't sure when, but we knew eventually we would. So the engineering group got together and developed IP version 6, which is 128 bits of address space. That's 3.4 times 10 to the 8th terminations. That's enough to last until after I'm dead. Then it's somebody else's problem. So I am, along with my colleagues, urging everyone to implement IP version 6 in parallel with IP version 4. So the last point on this slide is that because this was such an open environment, it was open in every dimension. The protocols were published in 1974 without any constraint. No licensing, no patenting, nothing. If you can implement a network that does this and find someone to connect to, you're free to do that. And we hope that the network would grow in a very organic way because of that. We said if you didn't like the protocols we had, pick some new ones, put them on top of the internet layer of protocol, and run in parallel with TCP or real-time or any of the other things which have developed over time. On top of which you can layer things on top of the existing protocols. It's a very layered structure. When Tim Berners-Lee invented the World Wide Web in 1991, he simply put HTTP on top of TCP IP. And because the network by that time in 91 was already getting pretty big, he had a ready-made platform to distribute the World Wide Web capability all across the internet. And he recognized that, and he did the same thing that Bob Kahn and I did. He gave away the protocols and basically said, if you can figure out how to write this stuff, you can use it to build web pages and to serve content. One other point about openness, the protocols themselves were published freely in the series called Requests for Comments that my best friend Steve Crocker developed in April of 1969 for the ARPANET project. So that series has documented the ARPANET and the internet ever since those two projects were underway. One of the things which I think was very important as well is that you could design and build new applications on the network, as I said before, without having to get permission from anybody. And finally, as the mobiles showed up, the first mobiles that were not so smart, they were just telephones, came around 1983, about the time that the internet was turned on. And we didn't notice that too much, but by 2007 with the smartphones, suddenly mobiles became an important part of the environment, and they had the same property that the internet has. If you could figure out how to use the application programming interface on the mobile to write a piece of software, you didn't have to know how the mobile worked. You just had to know what the API was. And so that's why we have so many applications on the mobiles, because you don't have to know everything there is to know about a mobile, only enough to know how to make a program run through the application programming interface. And so all of that has given the internet a remarkable robustness over time. So I want to come back now and try to observe what has happened economically speaking, because the cost of things changes your ability to execute. So as an example, we would not be doing this kind of computer networking except for the fact that computing costs were dropping faster than communication costs in the 1960s. And that observation was made by the guy who did the basic design of the, or at least started the project, ARPANET project at ARPA. His name was Larry Roberts. And he said because the cost of communication was higher than the cost of computing, we should use computers to manage communication. And so that's where the packet switching idea for the ARPANET came, and we used it again in the internet. And on top of that, the communications costs were coming down as well. Speeds were going up, equipment was getting cheaper. And so in some sense, the economics of the equipment drove us in the direction of the internet's architecture. So what did we see, in the history of computing and communication? So time sharing was allowing more than one person to share a computer at the same time, which meant the cost per user was coming down. Then came departmental computing, things the size of refrigerators instead of whole rooms full of machines. And those were the machines that led to packet switches. So the first packet switch for the ARPANET was the size of a refrigerator, but it was a lot less expensive than a $1 million machine. They were like $100,000. Then comes desktop computing, and the Macintosh and the PCs and so on in the 1980s, and that now makes it possible for an ordinary human being like you and me to afford to have our own computer. Then comes laptop computing and the World Wide Web in the 1990s. And I wanted to say something about the World Wide Web, an additional thing. Those of you who know a little bit about this history will recall that Tim released the design of the World Wide Web in 1991, and nobody noticed, except for a couple of guys at the National Center for Supercomputer Applications, Mark Andreessen and Eric Bina. And the two of them developed a version of the browser called Mosaic, which was a graphical user interface. It suddenly transformed the internet from a text-based environment to something that included imagery and formatted text. It made the internet look like a magazine. Now that got everybody's attention, including a man named Jim Clark, who had been the founder of Silicon Graphics in the Silicon Valley. He immediately went off and pulled Mark Andreessen and some of his colleagues to the West Coast and started Netscape Communications. Netscape Communications produced a browser and a web server system, and the next year, 1995, they went public. The stock went through the roof, and it started what we call the dot boom. Everybody was investing in anything that looked like it was related to the internet. But I want to come back to the browsers for a moment, because they had a particularly interesting property. You know, of course, that the HTTP is the transport protocol, and HTML, hypertext markup language, is the formatting language for the text pages, the web pages. What was interesting about their browser and all the browsers since is that if you were a user looking at a particularly interesting web page, you could say, how did they do that? And have the HTML of that web page displayed to you. This was open source en masse. It meant the webmasters could learn from each other. And so this idea of sharing what you can do and letting other people change and experiment with it is one of the reasons we had such a rapid growth of variation in the web space, because people were trying new ideas out all the time and sharing them automatically. So webmaster was a title that didn't exist until the early 1990s, and suddenly many, many people learned how to be webmasters from each other. And that taught me a big lesson about open source. So we get to the next development, which is the cost coming down so much that now we have tablets and pads and smartphones in the 2000s. And now we're having Internet of Things and embedded sensors in this decade. So we should talk a little bit about that. Here's what they look like. There are many, many more things than this that are now part of the Internet or will be soon. But these are things that surprised me, because when we were doing the original Internet design, it did not occur to me that a refrigerator should be on the Internet. I will say, however, there were jokes. One joke was, someday the toaster will be on the Internet. And we said, haha, wouldn't that's silly, right? Except there was this exhibition called Interop, which stood for interoperability, which was all about how TCP and IP could make everything interwork. And in one of the shows, I don't remember when, it could have been around 1990, somebody actually put a toaster on the Internet. You could send SNMP, simple network management protocol packets could be sent to the toaster to say, how burned do you want your toast? And so we couldn't make jokes about that anymore because somebody did it. So there's refrigerators, there are picture frames that started coming in the late 80s or early 90s, I guess. One of the things that, no, it must be later than that. Probably late 90s to see these. Anyway, what's interesting about those is that they can go and download pictures from a web page and then cycle through them. And so it's great for the grandparents, right? Because now we're all carrying mobiles. We take pictures of the grandchildren. We upload the pictures to a website. The picture frame downloads the pictures and then displays them so the grandparents can see what the grandchildren are doing. Unless somebody hacks the website where the grandchildren's pictures are supposed to be, and now the grandparents see something that they hope is not the grandchildren. So now security becomes important at home, just as much as it is at work. I used to tell jokes about light bulbs. I used to say, haha, someday every light bulb will have its own internet address. Well, I can't make a joke about that anymore either, because companies like Philips are making internet-enabled light bulbs that have radios in them. You can control the color and the intensity of the light from your mobile. And then there's Google Glass, which we're now in the second cycle of developing. But the thing that attracted me to this is that it meant you could let the computer become part of your conversation. We could hear what you hear, and it could see what you see. And so it suddenly becomes potentially capable of becoming part of the conversation. Instead of just being a thing that you control manually and type at, it's something that is listening to the conversation, and you could ask it questions. Kind of like Star Trek. You remember how they used to say, computer? And you would hear Majel Roddenberry's voice coming out of the air. This is starting to make it possible for a computer to become part of your conversation environment. And I consider that to be a very important step in the direction of making computers much more a part of our natural interaction space. And then I have to say, the surfboard in the middle is this guy invented an internet-enabled surfboard. I don't know him. He's Dutch. And all I can think of is that he was sitting on the water waiting for the next wave, thinking, if I put a laptop in my surfboard, I could be surfing the internet while I'm waiting for the next wave. So he put the laptop in the surfboard, and he put a Wi-Fi service at the rescue shack on the beach, and now he sells this as a product. So if you want to be out on the water surfing the net, that's the product for you. Now, I have one other example of this. This is getting, again, into the Internet of Things. It's sensor networks. I'm convinced that every building, every office, every house, every car, maybe even us, our bodies, will have sensors on them. And so this is my little example. I have an IPv6 radio sensor network in the house. In every single room, these little sensors are sampling temperature, humidity, and light levels. And then every 5 minutes, they send that data to a server in the basement. And at the end of the year, I have a very good engineering record of how well the heating and ventilation system has worked. And, it sounds like something only a geek would do, but actually it's smart to have that data to adjust the system based on real information and not anecdotal information. So one room in the house is the wine cellar. Then since we're here in Chile, you can appreciate how much I like wine. We spent 4 hours at Considerado on Sunday with the Enrique, who makes Don Melchor. I mean, it was an amazing 4 hours. So I care a lot about that. I have some Don Melchor in the cellar, 2006 and 2010. So that has been instrumented and alarmed. So if the temperature goes above 60 degrees Fahrenheit, I get an SMS on my mobile saying your wine is warming up. And one day that happened, and nobody was at home to recycle the cooling system. So I called the people who make this system. This is not me in the garage with a soldering gun. This is a product that was made by a company called Archrock, which was acquired a few years ago by Cisco Systems. So I said, do you make remote actuators? And they said yes. I said, okay, that's good. Does it have strong authentication? because I don't want the 15-year-old next door to mess around with my wine cooling system. They said yes. Okay, we installed the remote control, so when I get a message saying the cooling system is off, I can remotely start it up again. And that happens, not very often. But I sleep better when I'm away. Then I got to thinking, I could tell that someone has gone into the wine cellar, even if I'm not there, because the sensors can see the lights went off and on. But I don't know what they did in there. So I thought, okay, why don't I put RFID tags on each bottle and then have an RFID detector to do instantaneous inventory? So I now have the tags and I have an RFID detector installed in the wine cellar. And that way I can tell if anybody went in. And I could tell if any bottles have left the cellar without my permission. So I was describing my design to an engineering friend who, after hearing this, said, "You have a bug in your design." What do you mean? Well, you could go into the cellar and drink the wine and leave the bottle there. Okay, now I have to put sensors in the cork. And if you're going to do that, you might as well sample the esters in the bottle to see if the bottle is ready to drink. So before you open the bottle, you interrogate the cork. And if it says this bottle got up to 85 degrees because the cooling system broke, that's the bottle you give to somebody who doesn't know the difference. So this is very practical to have all around the house. I believe that this will be common. People will use these sensor systems for security. They'll use it for environmental control. They'll use similar kinds of systems like this to manage their entertainment systems and so on. So I think this is going to be part of the future. Sensors will be a normal part of the internet environment. So let's go on now. Looking again at the economics of things and how economics has such a profound effect on what works and what doesn't, technically and from the business point of view. One thing you can see is that as the World Wide Web showed up around 1991 or so and became very visible in 1994 when Netscape Communications began shipping its product, we were aware that we were going to have to start finding things in this growing network even before the World Wide Web. So the Wide Area Information System was developed in 1988 by Brewster Kahle, who today runs the Internet Archive in San Francisco. He's downloading the web on a regular basis and saving it. He has a Wayback Machine that lets you go and look at what the World Wide Web appeared to be in 7 or 8 years or 10 or 20 years ago. Then Archie was another search system from a university in Canada. Gopher came from the University of Minnesota in 91. Yahoo was a startup out of Stanford University in 94, just as we're starting to see the World Wide Web take off. Alta Vista was a spin out from Digital Equipment Corporation, and of course Google came along in 1998. So what happened once the World Wide Web was in place, people started pouring information into the net. And they didn't care if they got paid for the information. They just wanted to know that the information was useful to somebody else. And that is a phenomenon which I find very heartwarming, really, that people cared enough to share their information in the hope it would be useful to others. And of course, that caused a huge amount of content to be on the net, and we needed search engines to help find the data. The same technology, the World Wide Web technology, and the underlying internet made for some real challenges to the print publishing industry, newspapers and books and so on. But I will say that that's not the only challenge that faced by the journalism. The demise of the newspaper business, the financial side of it, is partly a result of the arrival of radio and television. Originally, print, especially newsprint, was the cheapest way to distribute a lot of information on a regular basis. And of course, everybody wanted to know what's new. And so the newspaper publishers realized that since people were reading the newspaper to find out what's new, they could sell advertising and classified ads and display ads and so on. And so this made for a really powerful business model. because the advertisers wanted to reach the consumers wanted to read the news, and you could show them advertising at the same time. However, there were limitations. Because it's a physical thing, you had to have a deadline in order to run the print presses to get the newspaper out in the morning. So that meant that the information was already old by the time you got the newspaper. Second, the ads didn't change. They were the same. Everybody saw the same ads. Along comes the World Wide Web and Google and the Internet, and suddenly it's possible to show people different ads depending on what they seem to be interested in. You could even figure out if they did anything with it, because if they click on the ad, you know that they looked. And so suddenly the feedback loop was very different, and the ability to allow things like dynamic choices, to add audio and video, to run auctions for which ads are run, which is what we do at Google. All of that really changed the model of potential advertising instead of print media with the fixed ads. And so all of that has challenged the publishing industry, especially journalism. And we've had discussions about that during my several weeks of visit here in Latin America. And it's very clear that in democracies like this one in Chile and in many of the other countries in Latin America, a healthy press is very important. And so figuring out new business models that will support the journalism business is very important, I think, for our societies. But we still are searching for what the right business models are. The basic model has been challenged by the fact that a different economics showed up in the new media. And finally, what I found interesting about the Internet itself, going back now to its ability to do almost anything, we no longer make phone calls in the point-to-point sense as much as we engage in various multimedia communications. So at Google, for example, we have Google Documents, could be spreadsheets or text documents or a presentation. We have Google Hangouts, which is a video and audio information exchange. And so you can be simultaneously talking to each other, looking at each other, editing a document concurrently, all of which is maintained in synchrony and multiple copies distributed around the net, which, by the way, is not so easy. But the result is that we no longer have a medium which is single purpose, but is using all the media in various mixes. And so this is a completely different thing than the former single-purpose networking of the past. And I don't think it should be treated in any way like the single-purpose networking of the past. It should be treated as a completely new environment for people to interact. So let's go to the next slide. This leads us to a collection of policy issues that need to be attended to here in Chile, and frankly in other countries as well. One of them is to avoid unnecessary regulation, and in fact, we should give the regulators credit for deciding not to regulate something. They don't usually see themselves that way. They see themselves as getting credit only for regulating. And if we're trying to maintain an environment of innovation and exploration, the last thing you want to do is to build a box out of which you can't go because the regulator puts you in there. The right thing to do for an innovative economy is to regulate as little as possible. Second, I think we want to make sure that the users of our products and services in this environment have as much choice as possible. And as you can see from the earlier slides about the openness of the net, if you didn't like the protocols that are already available, you're free to invent new ones. And this idea of being able to invent new things and incorporate them into the architecture is a really vital part of making innovation a key part of the economy. We also need to help small and medium-sized businesses in Chile recognize the utility of being online, the utility of having web pages, the utility of transacting business through the net, and in particular, the ability to address a global market, because the internet is a global system. It's not a national system. The consequence of that is that once you're up on the web, you have the possibility to show what you can do, what services and products you have available to in a global market. You have to work on that. You have to make sure things come up in the right languages. You have to be conscious of various cultural variations and maybe even business variations and legal variations. But the fact is that reaching a global market is really important, because Chile has a very good economy, although I know you have problems right now with the price of copper, for example. But no matter how big the Chilean economy is, the global economy is bigger. That's true for every country. And so being able to address a global economy is really important. And finally, I think that it's very important here and elsewhere to make infrastructure investments. Not only can the government make those investments, but the private sector as well. And so you have the digital agenda, you have the Southern Optical Fiber Project, which is to string fiber all the way down to Punta Arenas, for instance. And then also possibility of additional cable, undersea cable, to connect Chile to the rest of the global internet. At the moment, I think a lot of your connectivity goes through Argentina. And, that's okay. They're a friendly country, but it would be nice if you had your own high-capacity cable that you didn't have to worry about anyone else's policy getting in the way. Now, I'm really, you all are using mobiles, and you know that could be better in some parts of the country where there isn't very much connectivity. And finally, I have to say I'm really proud of the fact that Google selected, you should be proud of the fact, Google selected Chile as the sole country in Latin America to have a Google data center. And we did that on purpose. We analyzed all of our options, and we concluded that in Quilicura that we had good connectivity, we had power, we had cooling capability, and we had a business environment that invited us to make that investment. And so it's growing. I was there yesterday. I see the new buildings that are starting to be constructed. So the capacity of that data center is getting bigger, and we're happy to be here. And finally, there's the Inter-American Development Bank has a Connect Americas campaign with partners here in Chile. I'm very excited about that because I think that we need to create a broad infrastructure of connectivity in Latin America, linking the various country networks to each other and to the rest of the world. So I realize I'm running out of time here. So there are some additional policy challenges. I think this is the last slide. There are additional policy challenges that face all of us, not just here in Chile or not just here in Latin America. One of them is this term internet governance, which is not internet government. I want to distinguish this. Governance is a very general term. And there's technical governance, which is applied by the standards to the way the internet works. The Internet Engineering Task Force is one of the places where those standards get made, and they determine what the network is capable of doing. Then there are questions about what people are allowed to do on the net. Now we get into questions about legal constraints. We get into questions of regulation. We get into questions about social conventions for the use of this technology. And one thing I would say is true everywhere I go is that the technologies of communication, the smartphones, the cameras, and so on, have raced ahead of our intuition about the impact of those technologies. So I think we are still not entirely sure what the social impact is of the devices that we're using and the services that we are building. And it's going to take us some time to figure out what kinds of conventions make sense. And so we shouldn't be surprised at that, but it does mean that we're going to go through a period of time where we will experience some things that we think are not good on the net until we figure out the right way to cope with them. Their privacy, for example, and safety have become a very big issue. And I keep thinking, with the Internet of Things coming along, we should care a lot about safety because there's software running those devices, those appliances. And if you know anything about software, you know it's impossible to write software that has no bugs. So the software has bugs, and that means it doesn't always work the way you intended it to work. And you can imagine some of the bugs causing some serious hazards. I will confess to you that at Google, we have these computer-controlled massage chairs. I don't get in them because I'm afraid there's a bug in there and it's going to close on me when I'm not looking. So I worry, maybe I'm a little paranoid about that. But the idea is that we need to pay more and more attention to the safety of the software as we depend more and more on programmable devices. Similarly, privacy. Just to give you a small example, the sensor system that I have running in the house, which is taking temperature readings every 5 minutes, if someone got a hold of those temperature readings for, let's say, a 6-month period, you could almost figure out from that how many people live in the house and which rooms do they go in, and is anybody home. And so the bad guys might be very interested in that information, so I should be careful to control access to it. On the other hand, if the house is on fire, I may very well want the fire department to have access to that the most recent information in order to figure out where is the fire and are there any people in the room and how do I rescue them. So suddenly I have this conundrum that under certain conditions I want the fire department to have full access to the data until the fire is out, and then I don't want them to have access to it anymore. So it's ephemeral access. But I don't want the bad guy to have access to it at all. And so figuring out how to support that set of requirements is a non-trivial exercise. Similarly, anonymity I consider to be a very important feature of the internet, but it isn't the only one. So imagine, for example, you're having a conversation, like a chat, with someone that you don't know. And the conversation is interesting, so you're chatting back and forth. And then, for some reason, the person on the other end says, could I borrow, 200,000 pesos? Or maybe pick a bigger number if you like. And your first reaction to that is, well, wait a minute, I don't even know who you are. I need to know, do you have a job? Do you have any money in your bank? Do you have a credit record? And so suddenly you want some strongly authenticated information about this party. Of course, you could say, please give me this information. And the person could say, no, I won't. And you could say, okay, I won't loan you any money. And that's fine, perfectly okay. But you should have the ability to demand strongly authenticated information if the situation calls for it. And we should provide technology to make that happen, to make that available. It's just that you shouldn't be forced into using it except when you want it. And the other party can say no if they want to. This is the best of all possible arrangements, and people can stay anonymous if they wish. So that's the sort of thing that we should be considering. With regard to other kinds of legal frameworks, what about digital signatures? They're very important for doing contracts online. But we don't have an agreement on a global basis, or even necessarily a bilateral one, about the legal meaning of a digital signature. So if you and I do a contract online and we each digitally sign the document, and then one of us fails to perform, and the other party says, well, I want my money back. The question is, if you say, I have this digitally signed contract, which court will treat that as a weighty and decisive contract because of the digital signature? And it depends on a lot of different variables. Before you got issued this certificate that would allow you to digitally sign something, how were you identified by the party issuing the certificate? And what weight does the law give to that? So we haven't worked this out. These are things we have to discover how to do. Intellectual property is a huge issue in the online world because once things are digital, it's easy to reproduce them and distribute them. And so the people who make movies and music, of course, are all concerned about that. And we need to cater to their concerns, but at the same time, we need to give the general public the ability to share things that they should legitimately be able to share. And so, again, we have all kinds of issues to sort out there. Another interesting example is that intermediaries like us at Google, we just index the World Wide Web, and we tell you what's there. We are not responsible for what's there. We just tell you what we found. And for people to say it's your fault that there's bad stuff on the internet is crazy. But there are people who think, because we index it, that we should be the ones who should somehow censor it. And my reaction to that is, wait a minute, it's the guy that put the data on the net that should be dealt with, not the guy that indexed it. So that's clearly a self-serving statement, but I think it's also justifiable. And finally, I think we need to worry a lot about anti-competitive behavior. And the reason that's important is that sometimes access to the internet is, you have limited choice of who will give you access to the internet. In the U.S., we have this problem. Broadband access to the net is typically provided at most by two different providers, a telephone company and a cable company. Google has recently entered into the fray in a few cities with its own fiber offering billion bit per second service, so we're a third competitor potentially. But if you're in the rural part of the country, there's nobody giving you broadband service at all or selling you broadband service, so there's no competition there at all, and that's bad for the consumer. In other parts of America, anyway, maybe there's only one provider for a given consumer. It might be a cable company or a telephone company, and only one provider is otherwise known as a monopoly, and that means that you're now at the whim of that provider. And maybe if you're lucky, you're in a city and there's a choice of two, or maybe three. But that doesn't necessarily discipline the market. So sometimes you need a regulatory framework that prevents anti-competitive behavior when you don't have enough choice as a consumer. So these are not by any means a long, complete list of issues arising, but they are examples of things that you and and people in other countries are going to have to struggle with, including those of us in the United States. So I hope this gives you a sense for the innovation in the internet and the challenges that are associated with it, and the reasons that innovation has been so successful in that environment. And I'm looking forward to the chance now to have a conversation with you and to try to respond to questions. Muchas gracias. So now I need to, before you start asking questions, I need to get my translation gear on. Yo hablo no español. It's very embarrassing. You know, I've been telling people about how embarrassed I am that I don't speak Spanish. And the first time I tried to explain this, I started out by saying, yo estoy muy embarazado. And they told me that doesn't mean you're embarrassed, it means you're pregnant. So I don't say that anymore. Yes.
Bueno, perfecto. Bueno.
Wait a minute, I'm just hearing Spanish. That's not helping me at all. Are we going to do this in English or Spanish?
I can do it both either, but
No, which way do you want to go?
so first we are going to listen a couple of questions.
Okay.
Okay. And then we see.
Okay, we have
So
to get-
the person that is going to ask, o la persona que va a hablar, diga si va a ser en español o no, si se pone los...
So, my
los auriculares.
recommendation, everything in español.
Todo en español entonces,
Sí.
todo en español, ¿ok? Ok, empezamos por ahí.
Sí. Buenos días, mi nombre es Moisés Sánchez, soy secretario ejecutivo de la Alianza Regional por la Libre Expresión e Información, que es una coalición que trabaja en Latinoamérica en esos temas. Mencionó ahí en su conferencia que hay que encontrar modelos de negocios que fortalezcan el periodismo, porque el periodismo es importante. Me gustaría que pudiera profundizar más en los alcances del trabajo de Google vinculado a libertad de expresión, el tema de la protección de datos y sobre todo el tema del derecho al olvido.
So the right to be
Nice.
forgotten. Is microphone is working okay?
No,
Is it?
no.
I can't tell. How many engineers does it take to turn on a microphone?
No, it's there, it's there.
I thought it was there. Wasn't it on? Testing, testing, testing.
Yes.
It works now. Okay. So the question is data protection, right to be forgotten, and what was the other one?
And press,
I'm sorry.
and our relationship with the press.
Okay. I'm sorry. Price?
Press.
Oh, press. Press. Okay. So let's take these in reverse order. The European view. Now this thing is. I'm hearing that, and I don't need to hear that. In the European view, there are things on the internet that people should be able to erase. And we don't necessarily disagree with that, but we're the indexers of the net. We're not the people who put the information on the World Wide Web. And so in my view, asking the indexer to remove content or to erase it is not as effective as having it removed from the website where the person who is complaining about it has that information located. It also puts us in a very funny position because we're a private sector
You're
company.
off. Yeah.
It's not working again.
Yeah.
Do I have to clip this to my left nostril?
No.
Do you think that it gets turned off when I put it in my pocket?
No battery.
It's a dead battery? This reminds me, okay. Testing, that worked.
Yeah.
You know what this reminds me of? You have entertainment equipment at home, and you have these little controllers, the infrared controllers, and there are a little pile of them on the table. And if you're like me, you fumble around for a while to find the right one, and then that's the one with the dead battery. So, so here we are. Okay, so here's what we have to do in response to this request to remove index information. We have to remember everything that we're supposed to forget, because you have to remember to take it out of the index. And of course, this is going to get bigger and bigger over time. And so from a purely engineering point of view, this is weird. So we're trying to respond to it, but I think over time, people may discover that this is not the best way to address the problem. Okay, second problem, with regard to the press, if what you're saying is what can we do to recreate a healthy press, a healthy journalism? And I think I don't have a perfect answer to this. If I did, I would be executing. But I think that we have to examine, again, business models, and we have to examine utility. Because we have to think like the consumer now. What did the consumer get out of the newspaper and magazine publishing in the past? Well, they got information they cared about, knowledge that they cared about, and they got exposed to ads. The internet provides a lot of that already. And the question now is, what can the journalism world do to make themselves even more relevant than they used to be in the past? One answer may be to provide information to the readers about what they can do about what they just read. And so are there hyperlinks that we can take the reader to that says, and because of what you just read, here are the actions you could take. Here are the ways you could analyze the situation we have reported about and take an effective action that is to your benefit. So it may be that we may have to call on the journalism community to work harder to make the information they provide more useful to the consumers. And as you start to push down that direction, you start to get back into a subscriber kind of model where people pay for the expectation that there will be useful content coming to them. When we subscribe to magazines, we all know that we're not going to read every article. But we know that there will be enough articles of interest to us that it is worth subscribing to help support the production of those articles. And so this sort of utility model may turn out to be the path that we get in. Okay, so that's the press and the right to be forgotten, what I leave out.
The third one, yeah. Privacy.
I'm sorry?
Privacy.
Privacy. Well, okay. So I'm not going to quote Scott McNeely, the former chairman of the board of Sun Microsystems, 20 years ago said, there isn't any privacy, get over it. I hope that's not true. But it's harder. It's really harder to achieve privacy. And there are a number of reasons for that. One of them is that we are all running around with mobiles that have cameras in them, and they have radios in them, and we can take pictures and videos and we can upload them to the internet. And some of that is really beneficial. Sometimes we see things that we would never have been allowed to see that we should be concerned about. And in other cases, we are exposed, so to speak, even when we didn't want to be, because somebody took a picture and put it up on the web. So this is an example, I think, of the social conventions that are still kind of immature about the use of these technologies as they impact privacy. One thing I can tell you that I've noticed in the last year or so, maybe a little more, is that when people come to take pictures or want a picture with me, they ask first. They don't just take the pictures. And I thought that was a very interesting evolution, that users are beginning to recognize that taking a picture with the intent of posting it is a kind of invasion of privacy, and that you should ask first. And so I'm guessing, look, I'm an engineer, I'm not a sociologist, but I'm guessing that we will begin to evolve behaviors that take into account some of the concerns for privacy. There are other concerns that people have, and we have them at Google. We're very concerned to protect our users' privacy. And in particular, we've gone to a great deal of trouble to make sure that all of the data that's transferred in our system is encrypted strongly. We even encrypt data, like your email. When it's stored on the disks of our systems, it's encrypted. So we're trying to make sure that if a break-in occurs and someone gets access to those data files, that they have a lot of trouble trying to read them because they're encrypted. So we're doing those sorts of things very deliberately. We also recognize that users like you and me are terrible about picking passwords. And so username and password as an access control mechanism to protect your privacy, protect access to your files, protect access to your Gmail. Username and password turns out to be weak, especially with those people who pick password as the password because it's easy to remember. The trouble is the bad guys know that too. So at Google, we have developed what we call two-factor authentication. We're not the only ones. This is not a new idea. But we're required to use two-factor authentication as employees at Google. So we have usernames and passwords, but we also have this extra little device which you plug into the USB or you run a program in your mobile that generates a random password that you use only one time. And in fact, there are some new developments that are even more elaborate than just generating a cryptographic password. But the idea is that if someone manages to get your username and password out of some phishing attack, or maybe someone has broken in and found some of your personal data, they still can't get into the system because they don't have the second factor. They don't have the mobile, they don't have the little USB device or the near-field connection device that provides the second password. So we've been making that available freely to the public, and encourage everybody who's using the Google products to also make use of two-factor authentication. We've also done a few other things, like we ask you for a mobile number so that if it looks like someone is trying to tell us, I forgot my password, would you please give it to me, we can verify that it's you who's asking for that and not somebody else. These are all attempts to frame a more controlled access environment to protect the privacy of our users. The last point I would make is that some people misunderstand what Google's business model is. They think that we collect all kinds of personal information and sell it. We don't do that. If we did that, we would be out of business tomorrow morning. No, what we do, in fact, is try to follow what you're asking for example, in the search engine, and then figure out what that means, from our point of view, what that means about which ads we should be showing you. Because we want the ads to be of interest as opposed to another annoying thing. And so in the case of Gmail, for example, the program sees words in the text of the Gmail and tries to figure out which ad should I show you that might be relevant to what's in the Gmail. That's it. So we're not assembling a big dossier. And you're worried about that, we have a privacy dashboard that you can go look at. And if you haven't done that, and if you're a user, of Gmail or other Google products, you should go look at the dashboard, see what's there. You can remove things if you think you don't want them there. So the whole point here is to give you transparency and insight into what Google uses in order to serve ads, and that's all we do. Okay, that's a long answer, but
Okay.
thank you.
Bueno, vamos
Okay,
switch to
I need-
Spanish. Tiene una pregunta.
This is a little complicated because I can't turn this off.
Okay.
Ok.
Yes.
¿Aló?
Sí.
Bueno, primero que nada, muchas gracias. Quería preguntarle sobre la importancia de la inversión en I+D del gobierno en el desarrollo de la innovación, principalmente pensando en que en una primera etapa, desde el 57 hasta los 90, tuvo insertos en la respuesta de Eisenhower al Sputnik, y con esto se crea ARPA y viene toda esta historia. Luego la ley Gore, que nos ayuda desde el 91 en la expansión comercial, y en una siguiente etapa toda esta contracción que viene después de la caída de las Torres Gemelas. Entonces mi pregunta es, ¿cómo en un país como el nuestro, que invertimos muy poco en I+D, es decir, estamos hablando que en una primera etapa el 5% era más o menos de inversión, podemos llegar a pensar en tener innovación, o tenemos que evangelizar aún más a nuestros políticos en torno a esto?
Okay, I have to get myself cycled back so I can hear what I'm saying. First of all, yeah, this is okay? So,
Yes.
all right. So, first observation, I hope you don't feel like somehow the train has already left the station and it's too late. It's not. What's happening, I tried, maybe not very well in this talk, to persuade you that the internet keeps reinventing itself because of this open architecture. People keep adding new functionality. So the train may have left the station, but people are still building the cars, and you can get on the latest one. So you don't have to get on the old car with the old technology. You can get onto the new car with the new technology. So you're not really behind necessarily. Whatever you invest in terms of infrastructure, will be the latest technology, or at least it should be. There's no reason to recapitulate all of the things that other people have already gone through if you're getting to start new. So to give you just a concrete example, looking at the Southern Fiber Plan, which is very ambitious. I mean, pulling fiber all the way down from here to Punta Arenas is a big deal. And it's going to take some time to get all the resources in place. And I got to thinking the other day, wait a minute, I just had an experience in João Pessoa in Brazil during the Internet Governance Forum meeting there 2 weeks ago. And I thought, we should show people who are coming to that meeting, there are people who are concerned about what Internet governance is about, that it's possible to put high capacity into a relatively remote location in almost zero time, not counting how long it takes to get through customs. So Google arranged to have an O3B, this is other 3 billion satellite station, put into adjacent to the meeting site. And it got turned up in a couple of days. It was delivering 400 megabits per second in the downlink and 100 megabits per second in the uplink. And this was a ground station that was actually designed for shipboard use. So it was a little more expensive because it had to be gyro stabilized. And that one cost $250,000. If you get the ground station that doesn't have to worry about stabilization, then it's less expensive and it runs at a gigabit per second in both directions. So I got to thinking, gee, for a relatively small amount of money, you could put ground stations along the way, going from here to Punta Arenas, where there is population centers, and then spread out from there. And that would give you two things. One, as the fiber connectivity finally gets completed, now you have two ways to get everywhere, one through the satellite and one through the fiber, which is always good, especially if the fiber gets cut. And second, it means that you could use the satellite links to connect all of these populated centers together. Now, look, I didn't do the economics. I didn't calculate, whether that's the right thing or not. But it seemed like a fairly modest investment in order to immediately get connectivity at high speed and to provide some redundancy in the system. And if you add to that building of additional undersea cable to link the country to the rest of the internet, you get a very rich possibility there. So what I would encourage is taking advantage of the latest technologies, if you can, in order to leap ahead of all of the previous technologies that you don't necessarily need anymore. And so I would encourage serious ambition about high capacity and broadband using the best technology available, because sometimes that's the least expensive technology too. So that's sort of where my head is on this whole get the infrastructure in place.
Aquí. Hola, soy Diego Gómez, soy profesor de esta universidad. Quería preguntar...
Wait, hold on, I got to adjust my hearing aids again. I have 4 different programs in my hearing aids and I have to match it to the headset.
Ok. Hola, soy Diego Gómez, soy profesor de esta universidad. Quería preguntarle qué es lo que se viene en términos de la seguridad de la Internet. Toda esta infraestructura internacional de alguna forma ha recibido muchos ataques y sobre todo donde tanto los gobiernos como ciertos países van interviniendo en los flujos en las redes, como lo que fue en China hace un par de años atrás o en Pakistán con YouTube. Más o menos, ¿qué es lo que se viene en términos de regulación? Si es que existe o si habrá algo así.
Okay, I need to discuss this a little because I'm not sure I got all of that.
So he's asking about internet security and,
Yes.
and governments really intervening
Okay.
in the process.
So, on the whole, governments are formed partly for the protection of citizens. Not all governments behave that way, but most of them are supposed to. So you could understand a government feeling responsibility for the safety of the citizens. And when you see some of the bad things that happen on the net, malware, denial of service attacks, break-ins, all of those various things which have the potential to do harm, you could understand a government reaction. We have to do something about that because that's our job. Sometimes you would try to impose regulation in order to inhibit some of the bad things from happening. I've come to believe, I'm not saying this is a conclusion as much as it is a belief, that there are only 3 ways that we can attack some of these potential hazards. One of them is to use technical means in order to prevent the harm from happening. And so, for example, the use of cryptography in order to protect privacy is, or 2-factor authentication to perform access control is an example of a technical response to a hazard. The second thing we can do is to decide, either nationally or even internationally, that certain behaviors are unacceptable in our society, and that if we catch you doing those things, there will be consequences. Now, we know that when we use that means of dealing with the problem, that we will not succeed in catching everybody. But we put everyone on notice that they are at risk
Sorry,
if they behave badly. Is that you or me?
that was me.
Okay.
Sorry for that.
No problem. Here we are at least saying to people, these behaviors are not acceptable in our society, and we will do what we can to limit your ability to perform those bad things, or if we catch you having done them, there will be consequences. So that's post hoc enforcement. The third thing we can do, which is going to sound very weak, is to say, don't do that, it's just wrong. It's just ethically wrong. Now, that sounds really weak, but think about gravity. It's the weakest force in the universe. But when you get big enough mass, gravity is powerful. And when you have a large population of peers who are all saying, don't do that, it's wrong, you put some pressure on people to behave differently. Again, there's no guarantee. But I think those three tactics cover a pretty broad range of responses to the bad things that happen. The thing about regulation, which I think is unsatisfying, is that you can make rules, but if you can't enforce them, then it doesn't help very much. And there are a lot of legislators, some of them in the United States, who sort of stop at the point where they said, we made a law saying this is illegal. It says, well, thank you very much, Senator. How are you planning to enforce that? Because if you can't enforce it, it didn't help. And we don't always get good answers to that. We also run into the other problem, which is in the zeal to protect the public, you also completely destroy innovation. You destroy people's freedom of action, freedom of access to information. I mean, to come back to this right to be forgotten, there should also be a right to know, because there are things that you should know as a citizen of a democracy, and to be denied access to that is a violation of your right of access to information. So we have this hard problem to balance our response to the bad things that happen in the net and the potential inhibition of all the benefits that could be derived from the network. And I would submit to you that over the past 32 or 33 years, far more benefit has arisen from having this network available and growing than harms have happened. This is not denying that there are potential harms, and some real ones, but rather that the benefits have outweighed those harms. That doesn't mean we shouldn't try to deal with the harms. We should try to deal with them as we can. But to go to the extreme, someone could say there are bad things that happen to people using the internet, we should shut the internet down. That's kind of like saying, you know, people get into their cars and they drink and drive and they run into each other, or they damage property, or they kill themselves. And so cars are bad, and so we should not only get rid of all the cars, but shut down all the roads. Well, that would probably make things safer for people. They wouldn't kill themselves in the cars, but it would destroy an important infrastructure for the economy. Let's not do that with the internet. That would be a mistake. Wait.
Buenos días, bienvenidos a Chile.
Okay.
Fernando también. Soy Eduardo Riveros, periodista, estudiante de programación también. Escribo en The Huffington Post, en la sección latina, y en América Economía. Mi pregunta es la siguiente. ¿Usted cree que los últimos hechos de terrorismo significarán que gatillarán el salto cuántico en cuanto a la seguridad de Internet?
I had trouble hearing that.
Yeah, so basically...
Wait, now I have to go back this way again. I'm sorry about all this.
No, he's...
That's what happens when you have... I'm dependent on these things. Yeah.
asking about the last terrorism attacks
Oh.
linked to the progress of internet security. What's your view on that?
So it's very tempting, I think, for some people to assert that the terrorists are using the internet to advertise, and they are. It's true. If there wasn't internet, they would do other things. In fact, they did. They would hand out, you remember this, they were handing out copies of recordings of the terrorist leaders way back in the 1970s and the early 80s as a way of distributing information. So the internet is yet another way to do that. My reaction, and the reaction of others, is that the way to cope with this kind of abuse on the network is not necessarily censorship, but it's to put better information out onto the net. Esther Dyson, who is sort of a doyen of the computer science world, information technology world, said that the antidote for bad information is not censorship, but more information. We've not done a good job of explaining to people why terrorism is a bad idea, why ISIS is a bad idea, why in the long run it's not going to be constructive. We need to get better at explaining that to people who today are attracted, for whatever reason, to engage in terrorist acts. So that's one point to be made. I think that it is a mistake to assume that that somehow censoring the internet is the way to deal with this problem. There's a huge issue associated with censorship in general. First one is, who decides? Who decides what to take away and what to leave on board? Second, what are the criteria for deciding to take something away? And there is a term in English called slippery slope, where you begin to say, this is a harmful thing to have said, we should take it away. What if that now is a political statement that would normally be supported and permitted in a democratic society, but now you decide, well, that kind of interferes with our administration, it might damage our prospects in the next election, let's take that off the net too. And as you start to explore the potential hazards of this sort of censorship, in my opinion anyway, that you run the risk of destroying the society that you're trying to create. It's a little bit like the privacy and safety problem. If you want a really safe society, then you make sure that everything is transparent, everyone knows what everyone is doing. It's really safe, but nobody would want to live there because there's no privacy. On the other hand, if there was so much privacy that nobody knew what anybody was doing, then it's a very hazardous society to live in because the bad guys could operate completely independently. So someplace in between will be a comfort zone for each culture. It may not even be the same comfort zone or the same place, but somewhere we have to balance those two things. In the case of the internet, I still think that we have to combat the terrorism problem not by shutting down speech, but by finding better ways to discover what those people are doing. And I think that when you hear, for example, complaints that they were using encryption in order to protect their communication and therefore no one should encrypt anything, it should be illegal to encrypt. As soon as you do that, you now open up every single one of us to potential hazards in the net. Our privacy goes away, our financial transactions are at risk, the economy may be at risk. That's a mistake. It's an easy argument to make, it's the wrong argument. So you can tell where I'm coming from here. No magic pixie dust to solve the problem. We have lived as, our civilizations over the course of a few thousand years have lived through these kinds of problems before. And we've somehow survived, sometimes painfully. But it has not been by destroying technology that we have succeeded.
Now, short question, my question. So,
Sorry.
In getting back to innovation, technology, and people's lives, what is coming after the internet in 20, 30, or 50 years' time?
Oh, let me get my crystal ball out here. If I could really answer that, I would be off starting a new company, I think. There are some trends that you can see today that will help you see what might happen in 20 or 30 years. The first one is the trend of lower and lower cost for computing-based devices, eventually small enough to wear, small enough to be embedded in our bodies. And that's not a crazy science fiction. My colleagues know that my wife, who's traveling with me, has 2 cochlear implants. She was deaf for 50 years, and then had an operation that put electronics into her head that allows a computer to stimulate her auditory nerve in the same way that it would have been stimulated if her inner ear was working correctly. So she uses a computer to hear, and it stimulates the auditory nerve, and the brain interprets that as sound. So this is an early example of using digital technology interfaced to our neural system to recover, in this case, the ability to hear. We can predict with some confidence that there will be ocular implants for people who are blind. There will be spinal implants for people who have lost the use of their arms and legs. There are experiments going on today already in that space. So that's one thing which is almost certain to appear in the next 20 or 30 years. The second one, let me draw on a good friend, Mark Weiser, who passed away at an early age, unfortunately, but he was at Xerox PARC. And Mark used to talk about ubiquitous computing. And what he meant was, eventually the computers would just sort of disappear into the walls and into the furniture. We wouldn't notice them anymore. Communications would be everywhere and automatic. And so you end up in an environment which is online all the time, responsive to your questions, responsive to your needs. And it's just something that you assume is there. Now, if that sounds a little hard to imagine or to accept, those of you who have young children or grandchildren should be watching to see what they're doing with pads, tablets, and mobiles. Even kids at age, 2 or so are starting to use these things. And in fact, some of them will go up to an old television set and go like this and say it's broken because it's not responding. So they are the generation which just assumes this stuff is there and they incorporate it into their daily lives. Now, we didn't grow up with this stuff. For us, it's technology. Technology is what you didn't grow up with. So these kids have a completely different view of what the technology means. If you really want some good predictions, don't ask an old guy like me. Go ask a teenager and see what it is that they're expecting, see what it is they want that they don't have, and that will tell you what happens. Now, just to be fair, I think I can confidently say something about the interplanetary extension of the internet because I know that's happening. And so that's already underway. The internet has been revised, its protocols have been revised in order to work across the solar system. And that started in 1998, not with Google, but with a team that I work with at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory and the other NASA laboratories, and now with the other spacefaring nations. We have new protocols that overcome the challenges of communication over long distances. So we have those new protocols running here on Earth, on the ground. We have them running in the International Space Station. We have them running on the rovers on Mars and the orbiters. We have them running on a spacecraft that's in orbit around the sun. And we've standardized the protocols. They're going to be used by all the spacefaring nations in their new spacecraft that are going out to explore the solar system. And when the spacecraft have completed their scientific missions, they will be repurposed to be nodes in an interplanetary backbone. So it is, I think, predictable that over the course of the next 10 to 20 or 30 years, we'll see this backbone grow over time. And it will be used to support manned and robotic space exploration. So that's another thing that you can assume will happen because it's already underway. More than that, I think I'm not capable of guessing at. You could go talk to some science fiction writers, though, to see what they have to say.
Creo que estamos ya sobre el tiempo, así que quisiera desde Google simplemente también agradecer al Centro de Innovación de la Universidad Católica por dejarnos participar de este espacio. Realmente a las autoridades, Alfonso en particular y Begoña, muchas gracias realmente.
Por el contrario, como ustedes saben, tenemos habitualmente muchas reuniones de esta naturaleza y no quiero decir nada en contra de nuestros muy buenos habituales invitados, pero la verdad es que un invitado que va a dejar una huella en su pasada por este mundo superior al de muchos generales y presidentes que están en los libros de historia, eso no lo tenemos todos los días. Así que Vint, muchas gracias por estar aquí con nosotros. Lo mismo a ti, Fernando, y el resto de la gente de Google. Queremos creer que esta es una ocasión de apertura de conversaciones y que no te vamos a tener aquí por última vez hoy día, así no sea que tengamos que conseguir algunas botellas de Don Melchor para asegurarnos que te traemos de vuelta. Muchas gracias a todos ustedes.
Thank you. Muchas gracias.